I met her during my first year of university. She wasn't the loudest in the room, not the kind to steal everyone's attention, but there was something about her that made the world fade a little when she laughed. Maybe it was the way her eyes crinkled when she smiled, or how she always sat at the edge of her seat in lectures, scribbling notes with passion. We connected over small things, shared jokes during boring lectures, late-night study sessions, cafeteria coffee that always tasted like burnt regret. It didn't take long for us to fall into rhythm. We weren't the kind of couple that flaunted affection, but there was something deep and comforting about being with her. She made the chaos of university life feel like something I could navigate. We'd walk to campus together, trade notes, eat lunch under the same tree almost every day. It was mundane in the best way possible, predictable, safe. I trusted her implicitly. Our schedules weren't always aligned, but we tried. Even if it meant waking up earlier or waiting an extra hour after class, we made time. That's what I thought love was, making space for each other, even when life tried to squeeze it out. As time passed, I started noticing little things. Harmless at first. The way she started dressing a bit differently, or how she began hanging out more often with a particular group of classmates I didn't know well. I didn't ask questions. Why would I? We were solid, I thought. We had built something honest. She told me she had to stay late for group projects more often, and I didn't argue. She said she needed space sometimes, and I gave it to her. I wasn't clingy. I believed trust was the foundation of everything, and I never wanted to be that guy, the suspicious one, the one who interrogates his partner about every minute of her day. We still saw each other during lectures. Sometimes we'd sit next to each other in the back row. Sometimes she'd be a row ahead with her group. It didn't bother me. I told myself we were adults now. Needing space didn't mean anything was wrong. But I remember one day in particular, months before everything unraveled. We were sitting together in a large lecture hall. She was quiet, more than usual. Her phone buzzed a few times. She smiled faintly at the screen, quickly locking it each time. I looked away. I didn't want to be paranoid. At the time, I told myself it was nothing. Looking back, that was probably the first real sign. Later that week, she started insisting on sitting with her group instead of me during our shared classes. Group synergy, she called it. We work better when we sit together. I nodded and forced a smile. Of course, it made sense. It wasn't like I owned her seat. She started skipping our usual walks to campus, saying she was going in earlier or staying back after class. The excuses were never the same, but always believable enough. I wanted to believe them. I needed to. I started to notice a particular guy, tall, smug, always grinning like he knew something no one else did. He was in her group. He'd lean in a bit too close during discussions. I caught him looking at her longer than normal a few times. She never seemed to notice. Or maybe she did and just didn't care to hide it. I told myself I was imagining things, but sometimes we lie to ourselves because the truth feels too heavy to carry. I didn't know what was coming. I didn't know the worst betrayal of my life would happen in the place I felt safest, the classroom, with the woman I loved sitting just inches away from me. I didn't know that one day I'd feel more alone in a crowded lecture hall than I ever had in an empty room. That day hadn't come yet, but it was getting closer. It wasn't a dramatic discovery. No screaming, no found messages, no confrontation in the hallway. It was something far more brutal in its simplicity. A realization that crept in slow, patient steps, wrapping its fingers around my throat when I least expected it. It was just another lecture. We were in a large hall, the kind that echoes even the smallest sound. I had arrived a bit late as usual and slid into the second row from the back. She was already seated. I spotted her 2 rows ahead, slightly to the left, surrounded by her group, and him. He was sitting next to her, his chair just a little too close, his arm brushing hers as he reached for something in his bag. She laughed at something he said, tilting her head back in that way I once thought was reserved for me. It stung more than I admitted to myself. I didn't make a scene. I sat quietly, opened my notebook, and tried to focus on the lecture, but the words floated over me like static. I couldn't absorb anything. I couldn't stop watching the subtle touches, the occasional shared looks, the small gestures that seemed invisible to everyone else, but were now screaming at me. The professor turned down the lights for a presentation. A short video began playing on the screen, and the room sank into a soft blue glow. That's when I saw it. From my position, slightly elevated, I could see her shifting in her seat, subtly adjusting her posture. He leaned slightly toward her. Her hand disappeared beneath the desk. So did his. At first, I tried to believe it was innocent. Maybe they were sharing a phone, passing notes, something benign. Anything benign. But her head dipped slightly under the desk. It happened fast. Too fast. Like they had done this before. I froze. My throat went dry. My hands trembled slightly above my notebook. I couldn't look away, but every second that passed made it harder to breathe. My mind screamed at me to get up, to walk out, to do anything but sit there, watching the unraveling of my relationship like a spectator in a horror film. The video on screen played on. Students scribbled notes. Some laughed softly at a joke from the presenter. No one else noticed what I did. Or maybe no one cared. Maybe that's how betrayal works, not in a storm, but in silence, with everyone too busy to see the wreckage happening inches away. I wanted to believe I was wrong, that my mind was filling in the blanks too creatively, but I couldn't ignore the tension in their bodies, the way they seemed to move with synchronization born from repetition, from familiarity. This wasn't new. This wasn't accidental. This had happened before, and it was happening while I was right there. That's what gutted me the most. Not just the betrayal, but the boldness of it, the confidence, the comfort, the idea that she could do this not just behind my back, but next to me. While I sat, oblivious, still believing we were okay, still believing I mattered. After the video ended, the lights came back on. She emerged from under the desk, adjusting her hair, brushing something from her lap with casual grace. He smirked and leaned back in his chair, looking more satisfied than anyone had a right to be. She glanced back at me briefly, smiled, like nothing had happened, and I smiled back. Because what else could I do? Screaming wouldn't undo what had been done. Rage wouldn't bring back what had been taken. And worst of all, I didn't even know how long it had been going on. For all I knew, I had been the fool for months, maybe even longer. The lecture continued, pages turned, life went on. But something inside me cracked that day. A quiet, invisible fracture that split deeper with every second I kept silent. I didn't confront her afterward. I couldn't. Not yet. I needed time to process, to be sure, to gather the courage to face the truth in its full ugliness. But that night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the scene over and over again, wondering how long it had been happening, wondering what I had done, or failed to do, to become so invisible in someone else's eyes. That was the worst part. Not the cheating, but the fact that I was no longer seen. Days passed, then weeks, and with each morning, I woke up heavier. Not physically, but mentally, emotionally. It was as if carrying that truth inside me added invisible weight to my body. I'd move slower, speak less. My friends noticed, asked if everything was okay. I lied. Of course I lied. What else could I say? That my girlfriend was cheating on me beside me in class while I stared ahead like a mindless puppet. I still saw her, still kissed her, still held her hand as we walked around campus like everything was fine. She still sent me good morning texts, little hearts, little emojis, but every gesture felt hollow, performed, scripted, and now I questioned everything. Every moment from the past, every smile, every I love you. She didn't act guilty. That's what made it worse. She acted like nothing had changed. Or maybe she believed I'd never notice. Or maybe she just didn't care. I started looking for patterns, watching her body language, how often she checked her phone, how she sometimes disappeared right after class for 10 or 15 minutes, saying she needed to get coffee or call her mom. I started noting when she wore perfume, and when she didn't. When she dressed up just a little more than usual. I wasn't obsessive, not really. I wasn't even trying to catch her anymore. I already had. I just didn't know what to do with the truth. Confrontation felt like a grenade. Pull the pin and everything blows. But ignoring it was a slow death. I was bleeding inside. Every moment I kept quiet. Every time I pretended not to see what was so obvious now. One evening, we were walking back from a movie. I had barely spoken during the whole thing, and she noticed. "You okay?" she asked. "Yeah, just tired," I said. And that was it. She didn't press, didn't ask more, just took my hand and kept walking. Maybe she was glad I wasn't asking questions. Maybe she felt safe in my silence. Maybe she thought she was winning. That night, I sat alone in my room, lights off, screen of my laptop glowing weakly. I opened our old photos, us at the beach, us at a friend's birthday, her laughing, cheeks flushed, eyes shining like she meant every smile. I tried to remember what I felt when I took those pictures. I tried to remember when the love was real, if it ever had been. And then I did something I hadn't done in weeks. I went to our class group chat, scrolled through messages, looked for his name. He had always been around, friendly, harmless, I thought. I checked his profile, pictures of him with his friends, his car, his smirk, the same smirk he wore after that lecture. And then I found one photo I had never noticed before, one she had liked just a few days ago. A selfie of him, taken in the very coffee shop she disappeared to after class. My stomach turned. I began to connect timelines, messages, likes, locations, her routines. Everything I had ignored now glared at me like flashing neon signs. And I realized I wasn't just being betrayed in the present. I had been betrayed for months, quietly, systematically, while I sat in the same room, trusting her. The next day, during class, I didn't sit behind them. I sat beside them. It was intentional, deliberate. I wanted to be close. I wanted to see everything, hear everything. I smiled when I arrived, said hi. He nodded awkwardly. She froze for a second but recovered fast. I could feel the tension ripple beneath her skin. She didn't expect it. Neither did he. I watched how they avoided touching, how their hands stayed firmly planted on the table, how her legs didn't cross toward his. She laughed a little too loudly at the professor's jokes. He tapped his pen more than usual. I had disrupted their comfort zone, and it was satisfying in a quiet, twisted way. I wasn't playing detective anymore. I was reminding them that I existed. After class, she kissed me on the cheek. He disappeared quickly. She asked if I wanted to grab food. I said I had plans. I didn't. I just needed to breathe. Alone. That evening I wrote everything down. Not for her, not for him, for me. Every memory, every sign, every time I had chosen to believe a lie because it was easier than facing reality. I poured myself into the words like I was draining poison. And when I was done, I realized something terrifying. I still loved her, even with all the pain, even with the betrayal. My heart hadn't caught up with my brain. I hated her and missed her at the same time. I craved her voice and wanted to erase her name from my life. That kind of emotional contradiction tears you apart slowly. You begin to question your own sanity. How can love and hate coexist in the same breath? But they can. They do. And I was living proof of that. Time became elastic. It stretched long in quiet moments and snapped back in sudden waves of bitterness. I was haunted not just by what I saw, or what I thought I saw, but by what I didn't see. Every smile, every moment of silence, every pause in her speech now felt loaded, like a message coded in betrayal. I started drifting in lectures. My notebook stayed blank. I stared through the whiteboard like it was a screen playing a life I no longer recognized. She still sat near me, still touched my arm sometimes, still laughed and played the part of the loyal girlfriend. But I wasn't fooled anymore. I wasn't even confused. I was just waiting. One morning, I showed up earlier than usual. I sat in the far back row, deliberately hidden behind a column, just to observe. She hadn't noticed me yet. I watched her walk in, alone at first. Then, 5 minutes later, he came in, sat near her, not beside her. Too obvious. But close enough. She smiled. He smiled. Their eyes met a second too long. Then her phone buzzed. She glanced at it, smiled wider, typed fast. I felt cold. That was my confirmation. Not a confession, not a photo, but that one smile after reading his message. It wasn't for me. I hadn't texted her. That tiny moment, unguarded and raw, told me everything I needed to know. They had their language, their timing, their private little world, and I wasn't invited. That night, I didn't sleep. I walked for hours, through empty streets, past silent dorm buildings. I watched my reflection in the windows, blank face, clenched jaw. I wasn't angry anymore. I was done being angry. I was something quieter now, more dangerous, resigned. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want to scream or post some dramatic thread online or confront them in front of a crowd. I just wanted to vanish from their story, to leave a silence so loud they'd choke on it. The next day, I skipped class, then another. I ignored her texts, didn't answer calls. She sent a voice note. I didn't listen. I saw her the following Monday. She caught me on the steps outside the lecture hall. Hey, where have you been? I looked at her, really looked. Her hair was perfect, her smile, tentative, her tone, rehearsed. Busy, I said. She tilted her head, trying to read me, but I gave her nothing. You okay? I paused. Then, are you? That made her flinch. Just a bit. Of course, she said, too quickly. I nodded, walked past her, left her standing there. I didn't look back. Later that night, she showed up at my place. Knocking. Then silence. Then knocking again. I didn't open. Eventually, she left. A note under my door. Talk to me. Please. But what was there to say? I spent that night going over memories like evidence, reconstructing scenes, her sudden distance last winter, her weird texts during holidays, the way she used to check that I was asleep before sneaking off for water. It all clicked, all the pieces fit. And with each click, I felt a little more of myself fracture. How long had I been sleeping beside someone who no longer loved me? How long had I convinced myself that comfort was the same as connection? I wasn't blameless. I had withdrawn at times, gotten lazy, forgotten anniversaries. But I had never betrayed her. I had never disrespected her so completely that I thought she wouldn't notice, or wouldn't care, if I broke our trust. And yet she had. That was what stuck with me. Not the sex. Not even that it was with someone I knew, but the sheer casualness of it. Like I didn't matter. Like I had been phased out of my own life. Days later, I finally responded to her. One line. You know what you did. So do I. No reply. None came. She stopped showing up at class. Or maybe I just stopped noticing. It was like we had both agreed, silently, that the story was over, and neither of us wanted to read the last page aloud. The campus felt different now. Every hallway, every bench, every classroom echoed with things I didn't want to remember. I wasn't just mourning a relationship. I was mourning the person I had been while I was in it. The man who trusted too easily, who smiled without thinking, who thought love was a constant, not a choice people make every day. I started noticing her absence more than her presence. It was strange. The way someone can be in every corner of your life for months and then suddenly just not be. A phantom limb. I'd still turn to tell her something funny, still scan a crowd for her face, but she wasn't there, not anymore, and I didn't want her to be. At first, that was a lie I told myself, but day by day it became true. I filled my time with anything but silence. I picked up old hobbies, photography, late-night sketching, running. I signed up for classes I didn't need just to stay busy. I made new friends, real ones, not just people who circled our shared social bubble. I even joined a film club, just to sit in a dark room and feel something that wasn't bitterness. But healing is not linear. Some days were worse than others. Some nights I'd lie in bed and replay that lecture in my head, the one where it all cracked. Her under the table, him next to me oblivious, a living joke. Other nights I'd dream that none of it had happened, that we were still fine, that we were walking across campus together, sharing bad coffee and worse jokes. I'd wake up, heart racing, then feel that same cold emptiness all over again. But I didn't call her. Not once. And she didn't call me either. Mutual silence. It became our final conversation. One evening I ran into the guy, the one she'd chosen, the one who had sat beside me while betraying me. He saw me, paused, half smiled. I kept walking. But something shifted in me in that moment. Not rage, not even disgust. Just clarity. He didn't owe me loyalty. She did. And she threw it away for something cheap, something easy, something temporary. That wasn't on me. That was her choice. I finally allowed myself to stop asking why. The why doesn't matter when the what already broke you. Weeks passed. Then a month. Finals came and went. Summer loomed on the horizon. One day, I received a message. A simple text. No name attached. Just the words, "I miss how we used to be." I stared at it for a long time. I didn't block it. I didn't reply either, because I wasn't the same person anymore. and how we used to be was dead the moment she let someone else crawl into the space between us, while I sat there, inches away, stupid and trusting. That's not something you can come back from. Not really. So I deleted the message, not out of anger, out of peace. Because the truest form of moving on is not replacing someone. It's realizing you no longer need to. Summer arrived with little ceremony. The heat blanketed the campus, and most students scattered, either back to their hometowns or off to internships and jobs. For the first time in years, I chose to stay behind. No plans, no obligations, just time, uninterrupted and unforgiving. I moved out of the dorm we once shared, packed my things in silence. Her side of the room was already cleared. She had gone without a word weeks ago. I stared at the empty bed, the faint marks on the wall where her photos once hung, the scent of her still lingering faintly in the air. Funny how, even in absence, some people haunt you. But this time I didn't crumble. I folded the final shirt into my bag, zipped it up, and left, not looking back. I rented a small apartment close to the university. 1 bedroom, sparse furniture, old kitchen. But it was mine, my space. No echoes of shared lives, no forced small talk, no ghosts. It felt good to hear only my footsteps. During those long summer days, I started rebuilding myself. Not like before, not just distractions to fill the emptiness. This was different, intentional, steady. I took long walks, camera slung over my shoulder, capturing shadows, light, quiet streets, people in motion, strangers laughing, lovers holding hands. I didn't envy them anymore. I watched, documented, appreciated. There's something deeply human in simply observing the world without needing to explain your place in it. Books became my refuge. Philosophy, poetry, memoirs. I read about people who had lost everything and still found a way to wake up each morning. Their pain was louder than mine, yet they moved forward. I held on to that. Once a week, I'd visit the small cafe near campus. The barista learned my order. I'd sit by the window and write, not texts or assignments, but thoughts, scattered fragments, memories, questions I no longer needed answered, words I wished I'd said, words I was glad I never did. One day, a familiar figure walked in. Not her, but her friend. The one who used to laugh too loudly, who always wore chipped nail polish and smelled like vanilla and smoke. She saw me. Her eyes widened. She hesitated, then walked over. "Hey," she said softly. "Mind if I sit?" I didn't. Not really. So she did. We talked. About everything and nothing. She didn't mention her. Neither did I. Instead, we talked about books, movies, childhoods, about summer heat and cheap coffee. She had this way of speaking like nothing ever really surprised her, calm, direct, and vaguely amused by life's absurdity. After a while, she looked at me and said, "You're different now." I didn't ask how. I knew. We talked until the cafe closed, and when she stood up to leave, she smiled, not the kind of smile people fake out of politeness, but a real one. Like she was seeing me, not the shadow of who I used to be. I walked home that night feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not love, not even attraction, just lightness. A quiet sense that maybe eventually I'd be okay. The new semester began quietly. No fanfare, no fresh start, just a slow continuation of life that had shifted without asking me first. I no longer looked for her in the hallways. I no longer checked who entered the lecture hall or who sat in the far rows. If she was there, I didn't notice. Or maybe I did. But it didn't move me anymore. There's a strange freedom in no longer being haunted. I focused on classes again. My grades climbed. Professors started remembering my name, not because of the incident, but because of how I participated, engaged, present. I finally showed up for myself. The girl from the cafe, her name was Leah, became a quiet constant. We didn't define what we were, didn't need to. We'd meet sometimes after class or on weekends, usually without planning. She'd bring her sketchbook, I'd bring my camera, and we'd just sit in parks, on rooftops, outside cheap diners, observing people, trading quiet observations, letting the world unfold in front of us. One afternoon, while watching kids chase pigeons on the campus lawn, she said, "You ever think about running into her again?" I didn't answer at first. Then I said, "Sometimes, but not the way I used to." She nodded like she understood. Maybe she did, because the truth was, I'd seen her. Once. It was a couple weeks earlier, in the library. She was at the back, alone, scrolling her phone. She looked smaller than I remembered. Tired. Her hair was longer. She wore a hoodie I once lent her, years ago. It still had the faded logo from our first road trip. I watched her for a minute, unnoticed. Not with bitterness, not with rage, just a quiet detachment. She wasn't a villain in my story anymore, just a person who made a choice, a cruel one, but one I no longer had to carry. I left without saying anything, because closure doesn't always come from confrontation. Sometimes it's just the moment you realize you feel nothing anymore. And that's enough. Leah smiled when I finished telling her. "That's probably the healthiest thing I've heard all week." I laughed. And for once, I didn't feel like I was faking it. That night, I went home and opened a box I had avoided for months. The one with old photos, letters, inside jokes scribbled on napkins. I looked at everything, one by one. Some memories still stung, but most didn't. I took the box to the curb and left it by the trash, not out of anger, out of mercy, for myself. It was time to stop living among the ruins. I was no longer the boy at the desk, betrayed inches from his heart. I was someone else now, someone I respected, and that, more than revenge, more than justice, was what I truly needed. Time didn't heal everything. That's a lie people tell themselves to feel better. But time did allow me to see the wound differently, not as an open, festering pain, but as a scar. Faint, pale, not pretty, but mine. And scars don't mean weakness. They mean survival. It had been months. Seasons had turned. I had changed. I no longer needed to talk about what happened, not out of fear or shame, but because it stopped being the centerpiece of my identity. That story, the betrayal, the pain, the humiliation, it was part of my past, not my entire self. Leah and I never became something people would label, and that was okay. We drifted naturally, like friends who both knew they met at a moment when healing was needed more than commitment. She helped me rebuild parts of myself without even trying. One rainy evening, I sat alone at my desk, finishing up an assignment. Outside, the world was soaked in gray. I reached for my phone, not out of habit but to scroll through photos. There were new ones now, photos of friends, places I had been, me, smiling genuinely. I paused on one photo, a self-timer shot of me standing on a hilltop, arms stretched wide. Behind me, the sun was setting. It looked like freedom. I realized then, I hadn't thought about her in weeks, not truly, not in the way that clenches your stomach and twists your chest. And in that moment, it clicked. Closure isn't a conversation or an apology that never comes. It's not catching them in the act or watching karma do its job. Closure is when their name stops tasting like blood in your mouth. I leaned back in my chair, closed my eyes, and let the rain hit the windows. There was no cinematic ending to this, no final confrontation, no dramatic arc, just a slow, quiet ascent back to myself. One step at a time, and that was enough. Because I had survived being broken, while sitting just inches from the person who shattered me, and I had risen anyway.